The next work is by Albert Pinkham Ryder. This is called Death on a Pale Horse, or it's also known as The Racetrack, from 1910. It's an oil on canvas, about 28 inches by 35 inches. It's in the Cleveland Museum of Art. Ryder painted this work as a result of a feeling of despair that was precipitated by a tragedy that he had witnessed. Ryder was accustomed to eating dinners in a small New York hotel, the Albert, that was managed by his brother, William. He befriended a waiter at that hotel. The waiter had served him many times, and they always struck up conversations. One day in May of that year, the waiter informed the artist that he had bet every penny of $500, all his total life savings, on Hanover, Hanover, a celebrated horse that was running in the Brooklyn Handicap. The horse lost, coming in third. Ryder heard this news and couldn't sleep. He felt very bad for the waiter. He returned to the hotel the next day to hear that the waiter had just shot himself to death. Ryder said, quote, "This fact formed a cloud over my mind that I could not throw off, and the racetrack was the result." End of quote. When we look at this painting, we see that every line in the painting gives a sense of speed and immensity of scale around this track. Shadows fall here and there over the canvas. And we see the medieval figure of death, that is a skeleton with a scythe who rides in the opposite direction that was the custom of the horse races of the time. We see neither day nor night. We see a painting that shows a lot of gloom. And in the foreground, we can actually see a serpent. So we think that death is the only racer still on the track, because death outraces everyone. And we also see that the serpent in the foreground perhaps represents the serpent of temptation, of lust, a biblical figure from the Garden of Eden. And we can think of the waiter being tempted by the idea of riches, a potentially winning horse. And so we see that reference in this particular painting. And then finally we think of the title, not just the racetrack, but Death on a Pale Horse, which also gives us another biblical reference, that is to the Apocalypse. So we think of the New Testament Bible, and we can think of the book of Revelations by John, and particularly the end of the world, the breaking of the fourth seal after war and pestilence and famine have overtaken the earth. We see the figure of death who presides, who comes out into the world and overtakes it. So it's a very powerful painting, and in fact it's one that Ryder began. In fact, it took him years to complete. We find that the painting, in fact, was begun in 1896, and it wasn't until 1910, maybe 1911, that he finished it. Our next painting is called The Dead Mother by Edvard Munch, a Norwegian painter in the late 19th century. This is dated about 1900. And in this particular painting, we can actually see a little girl who refuses to accept the fact that her mother has died. In fact, we can see her sense of, we look at her face and we see that she seems to be numb. She's blocking her ears as if to deny the news. And we can see that her figure is surrounded. You can see that her figure is actually surrounded by these strong, intense colors, tracing these stronger grays and reds around the figure to emphasize the intensity of the form, the fact that the figure is filled with emotion. The artist witnessed, in fact, the death of his mother and also the death of his the death of one of his sisters when he was young due to tuberculosis. So these paintings are looking back, they're nostalgic, and at the same time they're terrifying experiences, and they're actually translated into this emotion by the quickness of the brushstroke, the strength of the colors, and this idea, in fact, the tracing over the main images of the figures, the main profiles, to create this sense of intensity in the Ben Shahn, Shahn, The Passion of Sacco and Vanzetti. Sacco and Vanzetti was one of the famous trials early in the century. We find that Ben Shahn was a realist artist who made prints and also paintings. He lived in New York City. He came to Brooklyn, New York from Lithuania when he was a child. And he was very much interested in politics, very much interested in liberal politics during the 1910s and 20s. The shoemaker Niccolo Sacco and Bartolomeo Vanzetti, a fish seller, both recent immigrants to the United States, trying to make their way in a profession that they had some familiarity with, were actually accused of the murder of a paymaster and a security guard at the Slater Morrill Shoe Company on Pearl Street in Braintree, Massachusetts in April 15, 1920. They were arrested about 20 days later in a nearby Brockton garage, picking up a car that police believed to be used in the robbery. Two things that were very troubling in the case that seemed to help indict these individuals and convict them of death by electrocution was the fact that on the first hand, they were Italian in their features, and the men who apparently held up and shot these guards were also Italian, and so there was a mistaken identity because of their like Italian features. The second thing that was troubling was the fact that these two men actually followed the anarchism, that is a radical political philosophy, followed the radicalism of Luigi Galleani, Galleani, an Italian anarchist who advocated bombings and assassinations to achieve social and political change. So these two aspects seem to bias the court. The artist seemed to be consumed with this particular subject for about a year. He made 23 paintings of different aspects of the trials, the original court trial and then the appeals trial. And so that was important. And he also said near the end that, quote, I realized that I was living through another crucifixion. Crucifixion as the meaning passion. In the painting, we see the sentencing judge, Webster Thayer, taking an oath of office. And this is in his portrait behind the courthouse steps in the background. And then finally in the foreground, we see the appeals court judges, Chief Justice Lawrence Lowell in the center, looking alternately sad, remorseful, or bitter, running the gamut of emotions or feelings about this particular trial from the court's point of view. And then finally, we see the irreconcilable viewpoint and proportions of Cubism. And lastly, the flowers and facial expressions, perhaps of innocence, of Sacco and Vanzetti. We see the lily flower, the symbol of innocence and purity, held in the hands of two of the judges.